So, my name is Christina Kumler, and as was stated, I work here at CIRES as a NOAA GSL employee. And my coworker, Ravon, is also a CIRES employee who kind of heads her smoke group. And then Jeb Stewart runs all of the machine learning projects within GSL. And I guess you would consider me a machine learning scientist. And today's presentation is going to be on taking advantage of machine learning for fire radiative power modeling. So, quick overview. I'm going to go into the background of the science. This is going to be a little bit more science than software talk, unlike the ones this morning. So, I'll introduce you to what FRP is and how we measure it and some of the issues we have with it. And then I'm going to go over the data in specific that we use to train our machine learning algorithms, the training of the random forest models that we found to be the best performing when trying to model and understand FRP. And then I'll take you over some results and explain where we plan to go to next. So to begin with, the background. What is fire radiative power? Why is it important to numerical weather modeling? What models are currently being used to look at FRP? And how do we think we can improve these models? So, if many of you are from the western side of the United States, fires are really important to understand, and you all know why. They're often unpredictable and costly, and they can even be deadly. And we have very fire prone weather in the summer and fall that can fuel major fire growth or breed new ones and leaves us kind of in an uncontrollable situation. Controlled fires tend to be a lot more predictable and short lived. So, for our work, we wanted to focus primarily on the less predictable wildfires because they tend to also produce a lot more smoke. Now, smoke from wildfires can also be a challenge. It's really bad for health. It causes issues with solar irradiance, and understanding smoke and aerosols is important for weather forecasts. So currently, this graph that you see is kind of how the HER smoke group represents FRP in the future. They take a yesterday's 24, this is for wildfire, I should say. They take a yesterday's FRP average, and then they apply this Gaussian persistence curve to it in the future. And so we had the idea that machine learning tools would be a really good improvement on this current method because they could take yesterday's FRP information, but they could also take the weather information that we have from our models, be it HER or RAP or even a global model. So some further background on the measuring of FRP. FRP can be derived from polar and geostationary satellites, and we collect terabytes of those satellite data every day. So FRP ranges in magnitude depending on the satellite it's collected from. So if you have a high resolution polar satellite, you tend to have more reliable FRP measurements that are of lower magnitude, but then when you aggregate it over the whole fire, you get a representative fire radiative power. And then geostationary satellites take this data at a more frequent interval over some region, but they're not as high resolution, which means that they can often be smoke blocked or weather blocked, and then you can't derive an FRP value from a grid cell. Within even those collections of FRP data, sometimes you have bad measurements. So if the sun is at the perfect angle over a solar farm, it'll flare and that'll register as a fire radiative power. As I'd said before, sometimes the smoke by the fire that you're trying to measure is blocking out this derivation. So again, we want to try to see how we can represent that FRP given the data that we collect, but also given the weather variables to better improve that variable for wildfires. So machine learning, I'm not sure the diversity of machine learning backgrounds of the audience here, but I'm going to be discussing methods that are called supervised machine learning, which means that I have to give the machine a training labeled data set that I'm trying to have the model regress and fit. The regression models can include models such as neural networks, deep neural networks, random forests, support vector machines, etc. In the early um, work, I was testing all types of machine learning models, but I found that a more simple random forest actually produced the best results. And when you have a model that's simpler but still gives you as good or better results, that's typically what you choose to use. Random forest models can be trained in Python. Their packages are readily available to anyone to use on their local machine. Jeb Stewart has been a wizard at getting some of these packages available to our group on our HPC system. And one last thing that I really liked about the random forest is it's really easy to identify variable importance, which not only allows us to model the FRP, but also allows us to better analyze the weather variables or the location variables or the time variables that we're giving the model, and then see which variables the model thinks are more or less important to deriving the best FRP model. So for those of you who aren't familiar with a random forest, think of a basic decision tree. You start at the top and then you work your way down in these bins to kind of answer your questions. And the problem with decision trees is that they tend to really overfit their data, or don't allow flexibility in results. So the random forest is an improvement on that by collecting a whole forest of these decision trees while randomly adding or dropping different data sets within the training data so that it's much less overfit. And in this particular example I'm showing, this was a random forest made with 10 trees, and each tree was set to a maximum depth of 3. So now we look at the data. What weather model data do we have available and do we want to use? What does the FRP data look like and do we need to clean any of it up? How do we combine different satellite FRP measurements? So as I said in the beginning of the talk, GOES has higher FRP magnitude measurements because it's at a lower resolution, while polar variables or polar FRP tends to be at lower values, but there's a lot more of those lower values for the same area that a GOES satellite might cover. So we decided to select the RAP data to begin with, and this was because we wanted to put all of these FRP values onto some numerical weather model grid and get them all mapped onto the same grid. And we knew that RAP data had temperature, relative humidity, wind gusts, vegetation, variables that you might think would fuel a fire. This isn't predicting if a fire is going to occur. This is, once the fire is burning, what is going to further fuel that FRP. So we selected those variables. Further inputs we decided to include, and I'll show that later, are latitude, longitude, time of day, yesterday's average FRP, and then a rolling FRP. So if it's 8 UTC today, it would take the previous 24 hours of FRP values over that RAP grid cell. The FRP data. So as I'd mentioned, we have GOES FRP data from 2018. That data is a little messy. I acknowledge that there are some imperfect values. Later on, we'll discuss what we did to try to help clean it up, but we are in need of better GOES data, and I do believe we have a higher quality controlled available to us in 2019 that we will use in our future work. And then the polar orbiters, I used NOAA, MODIS, and JPSS satellites. So it was my decision to combine all of these satellites onto a RAP grid. And we decided to basically have two separate data sets, polar wrap gridded FRP and GOES wrap gridded FRP. We do have a third combined, but we're not experimenting on that yet. So the polar wrap gridded FRP data that was created is a summation of all of the polar points measured over a wrap grid cell for that current hour for a passover of a polar orbiter. Now, it could include one or all three of the polar orbiters. It could include 2 points. It could include 15, but those are all summed over the wrap grid cell. They're not averaged, they're a summation. And now the GOES, more often than not, was just one GOES measurement per wrap grid cell. However, if there were two, then I took an average since they're higher resolution. So this is just one case study of the campfire from November 7th through 15th of 2018 in California. In this particular case, I have mapped out FRP for the whole fire, which means I kind of took a summation of FRP over 9 wrap grid cells to make sure I captured the entire fire, because sometimes the fire migrates. And then I plotted this against 2 different weather variables to see if there's any relation. If you see straight lines like that gap in the fire, that's where there was no FRP data, and I haven't pulled the weather data to fill in the gap, so it also follows the FRP with that solid line. But in general, this was a good way to, one, make sure that our FRP measurements and summations over a total fire looked feasible, but also to give us some clarity as to, were there trends in wind gust when there were higher FRP values or relative humidity. This is another way of visualizing this data, except this happens to be over all FRP points from the GOES satellite in 2018 west of 105 longitude. And it helps us look and see where the relationships might lie, indicating if we should include a variable into our training. So on the left, you can very clearly see a relationship between longitude and FRP magnitudes. And remember that these single dots are now just singular wrap grid points, because this includes every FRP point over 2018. This makes sense because we don't tend to see as many wildfires in other areas of the country. We do see them, but they aren't as persistent. I'm thinking of the one in the Appalachians. Like I said, they do exist, but there's still this trend that you'll see these higher FRP values with longitude. Another trend we noticed was hour of day. And if you ask an FRP expert, they're going to say, if it's, at night, the FRP tends to be lower than afternoon and evening hours. So I also chose to include the hour of day in UTC into our models. So training the random forest models, what did the setups look like for each model that was trained? When we were training the GOES FRP random forest models, these were intended to represent a current hour FRP based off of yesterday's FRP value and those meteorological values that were included to help reduce the controlled fire data points or bad data points. We set this rule that an FRP point for GOES data needed to exist in a wrap grid cell for 2 consecutive hours. It was not a perfect metric, but it helped substantially. All of my random forest models were trained with 1,000 trees and 42 estimators. I realize this has not yet been optimized. We're still trying to decide which variables we want to include, because we need to make sure we pick variables that are ready in real time. I treated the satellite measured FRP as truth. I created a model to model FRP at the current hour. I created a model to model FRP at the next hour. And I messed around with using that next hour model to map out 24 hours in the future, but I chose not to show these results. We split the data into 3 separate categories. So we trained models on all of CONUS, which would include more controlled burns and east and west west. We chose just to look at the west, which would hopefully really target those wildfires. And then the polar data went under all the same requirements except for the next hour requirement, because polar data, as some of you may or may not know, it doesn't it passes over an area quickly. So the likelihood of there being a next hour measurement is very, very low. So the results, how well did our random forest models do? The first model I'm choosing to share is a GOES FRP model trained just on the western states, where FRP needs to exist in the next hour and where FRP of yesterday had to be greater than 0. So it's not picking up the first day's FRP, but it is measuring next day FRP of a fire that's already burning. This left us with roughly 69,000 training samples and about 30,000 testing samples. The mean absolute error for the FRP that we found was about 75.5, and the variables we chose to include were the FRP from yesterday, the longitude, the temperature, the wind gust, the relative humidity, the latitude, the hour, and I included precipitation, but I might remove those from future models due to its 0 importance. What we can see on the upper plot on the right is a visualization of the importance numbers that you see. If the importance is higher, that means there is more weight to that variable input in determining and deciding the final FRP value. The plot on the bottom just shows us predicted FRP mapped against truth FRP, and you can see that it tends to stick close to the one-to-one line, but we do have issues when the truth FRP is higher. The predicted FRP doesn't seem to catch those higher magnitudes. So our second experiment was using polar FRP only on the western states, where again, yesterday's FRP is greater than 0, so the fire is already at least 1 day old. This greatly reduces our training data set. We have now about 5,800 training and about 2,400 testing. And some computer scientists who specialize in machine learning might say that's not enough. We understand, but we kept going anyways because this is not yet used in operation. And if we are able to use 2019 data, we'll be able to increase those numbers. But again, we can see the importances on the plot in the upper right, and then the trend plot to the lower right. The first thing I want to draw your attention to for these polar FRP models is that our dependency on FRP yesterday is a lot lower than for GOES. And we start seeing a greater importance on the meteorological variables that are also included within the model. We also notice that again, when that truth FRP gets higher, the random forest model tends to greatly underpredict your polar values. And this might be just because of the time gaps between polar data. Our third model was the same as before, but now we're looking at all of CONUS, so the entire United States. And we see that precipitation has a slightly above 0 importance, but is still pretty low on the importance. But your FRP yesterday is about the same value, 0.26, which means that the model is still looking at these weather inputs as well as FRP from yesterday. This last model that I'm choosing to share is using the GOES FRP for the western states, but is now looking at the next hour. So the FRP of the next hour still has to exist, and FRP from yesterday still has to be greater than 0, which helps reduce the controlled fires that we might see on the east. I'm running out of time, but the bottom right kind of shows the spread and the trend of how we still, when that FRP gets of higher values, are under predicting it slightly, but that we have a mean absolute error of 89.9. So where to next? How can we make a 24-hour forecast from this? Can we improve inputs? There are many, many other variable inputs that we can choose to select. In older experiments, I included vegetation, and it was shown to also be of zero importance. And when I removed the vegetation, it actually improved model performance ever so slightly. Um, we want to be aware of including FRP that's available in real time. So I could use FRP at a current hour to represent and predict FRP at a next hour, but it's most likely not going to outperform persistence. And we're not guaranteed to receive those measurements in real time if we want to use this in the modeling. Um, I need more quality controlled GOES data in our training data set. And I acknowledge as a machine learning scientist, we just need more data. So we need to include 2019 data now that we have that quality controlled and available. And I also was using a CONUS wrap domain. So in my future experiments, I'd like to include the entire wrap domain to insert those Canadian fires. And Canadian fires, wildfires, tend to be handled differently than they are in the US. So I've been informed that they tend to burn longer because they're not as mitigated. We also want to look at mapping this FRP into the future because it will help with smoke and aerosol modeling. I'm not ready to share the experiments. I did include them on this slide. It shows how this blue HER kind of curve is using just a Gaussian persistence from a 0 hour. And the random forest shows how it's not bound to that Gaussian shape. And sometimes it does a good job if it has, updated weather inputs and everything. And if it uses a rolling 24-hour FRP average, it can fit a fire better. But in general, after a few hours, the Gaussian method still outperformed my very initial tests. And with that, I will leave time for questions and thank you.